Hello, this is Dave Sugarbaker, and today is Memorial Day, or this is Memorial Day weekend. It's the 26th of May, 2024, and I'm going to talk about memories from Memorial Day. First of all, I have a Psalm 137, 5 verses from that psalm. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, and there we wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung up our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs, and our tormentors asked for mirth, saying, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." How could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. On a February Friday night in 1968, I got a call at my student apartment in Berkeley, California, telling me that my father had collapsed at work. He'd been taken to the hospital, and he had arrested once and been revived. Would I come home as fast as I possibly could? I left San Francisco at midnight. It was 55 degrees at the airport, and I arrived in Sioux Falls, South Dakota the next morning, where the temperature was 15 degrees below zero. My mother and my brother met me at the airport, and we went directly to the hospital. My dad was still alive and conscious, and a little bit shocked to see me at his bedside when I was supposed to be in California. I think it reinforced for him how grave his situation was. We spoke for a minute or two, and then we left him to rest. But a few minutes later, as we were walking the halls of the hospital, a Dr. Hart was called over the public address system for my dad's room. His leaking aorta ruptured, and he died. There were formalities to attend to, and many friends, relatives, and business associates to call. I spent the balance of that day doing whatever was most helpful. The next day was Sunday, and for some reason I felt that it was important for me to go to church. My dad was a well-loved Sunday school teacher there. I greeted and talked with people and accepted their condolences both before the service and after the service. I was able to interact with everyone, but the one thing that I couldn't do, I could not sing. I was shocked. I had it all under control, I thought, but I learned in that moment that singing comes from a different part of our insides than speech comes from. Singing puts us in touch with feelings that want to be let out. In that strange new land in which I had just lost my father, I couldn't sing. It would be just too overwhelming if those pent-up feelings erupted, piggybacking on the act of singing. Everything would come out in a rush, and in my brand new grief, it would just be too much. Psalm 137 describes how hard it is to sing in the midst of grief. How could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? The Babylonian occupiers of Judah and Jerusalem had an unusual way to be sure that the lands that they invaded stayed docile. They took all of the political and religious leadership, all of the educated people, and moved them to Babylon where they could keep an eye on them. The Babylonians may not have realized it, but the Jewish religion, up until that time, had been a territorial religion. Yahweh was God of Jewish territory, and Yahweh himself dwelled in the temple at Jerusalem. So if you were going to worship Yahweh, you had to do it at the temple. But Jerusalem had been destroyed. The priests and the musicians were all deported to Babylon. It made no sense to sing the Lord's song in a strange land. For it to be done right, worship had to take place in the now non-existent temple at Jerusalem. So if the only place to worship Yahweh was at the now demolished temple in the non-existent Jerusalem, then that should be an end to Yahweh worship, right? Well, before I answer that, I'm going to take a step back from biblical history for a moment and talk about the grief process. We know that traditional facets of grief are these: denial, bargaining, anger, depression, and acceptance. Grief counselors, though, have found that these 5 facets of grief may be helpful, but it's incomplete. The facets of grief are not a cookie-cutter, stair-step process. Everybody does it differently. But in the early days of grief, there may be more time spent in denial and bargaining and anger, the first 3 of those 5 stages. A year later, not so much. But the missing piece is the end result. It's not really acceptance at the end, really, but ultimately grief and loss force us to find a new normal. We keep all the love that we knew because our loved one shared his or her life with us, but over time, we find a new normal. So back to biblical history. The exile was a traumatic, grief-filled period of Jewish history, but it sparked the emergence of a new normal, and the new normal was the synagogue movement. Because of the loss of their temple and their displacement to foreign territory, in which Yahweh worship was theoretically impossible, Jewish religious leaders changed their understanding of Yahweh and of worship. Out of the loss of the temple grew a new normal, and the new normal was anywhere where you could draw together at least 12 bar mitzvah Jews, the Torah could be read and Yahweh could be worshipped. Yahweh was no longer limited to the territory of Israel, and the temple was no longer the only place for worship. That's the 6th facet of the grief process. We find a new normal. We don't forget our past. Our love for that one that we've lost doesn't fizzle out, but we need to find a new normal. The loss demands it of us. How can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? We find a new way to express our love and to make our voice heard. When my dad died, I couldn't sing. I could talk, but singing came from the heart, and my heart was too full. As time went on, I found my new normal. I told people it was like swinging on a trapeze, but now, after my dad had died, there was no more safety net. Now, a half-century later, I still talk to my dad at times. He's still part of my life, in that he's part of me, or maybe it's vice versa, I'm part of him. I marvel that I have lived, at this point, 23 years longer than he lived. Not because I'm a better person, but as a result of my biology and the luck of the draw. There have been several losses that have required me to find a new normal. But life continues, and I'm still singing. God bless you. That's all I got to say today, and I'll hope to see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.